Hey everyone, it's the Canadian Libertarian, and today I'm going to be having another conversation, this time with a gentleman named John Scott. He's a fellow Canadian that cares a lot about the important aspects of what it means to be a free human being. And the fundamental aspects of being a free human being, obviously, the most important thing is the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. Freedom, obviously, freedom, the thing about it, the very fundamental points that these things stress are freedoms. So without your ability and your express rights to promote and say what you have to say, basically you don't have actual freedom. So John has asked me and reached out to me, and I put out on another gentleman's post, Mr. Ronnie Cameron, that I want to talk to a lot of people about, and they can express and say whatever they got to say. Unlike a lot of people in the established media, I'm more than willing to give everyone a platform to say what they've got to say, because the minute anyone tries to intervene or subject people to certain particular opinions, then you're closing the mind off of the masses. And I don't like to close the minds off, because as with all times throughout history, it's been the freedom of speech that has helped educate, elevate, and enlighten the human population. So we're going to listen to what John's got to say. And like I say, freedom of speech is definitely one of those fundamental aspects of what human liberty represents. So you go ahead, John. You start out whatever you want to start with, and we'll just follow suit, man.
Okay, so hi to all my fellow Canadians out there from coast to coast. I'm just going to start with three things for Canadians who are interested in the topic of free speech. Number one, if you want to take notes, go for it. It's Section 2B of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That section gives us a guarantee of the right of freedom of expression. So a lot of people say free speech, and it's not, but technically in Canada it's called freedom of expression. And then moving on, another thing is the Criminal Code of Canada. We do have laws up here that are against hate speech. Now in Canada it's technically called hate propaganda, and it's covered in sections 318, 319, and 320 of our criminal code. And last but not least, the number 103, M103. Within the last year, there was a motion that was passed in Ottawa, House of Commons, which is against, discrimination and, racism. I think that's a great idea. But it's terribly worded in the sense that it seems to give one particular system, that being Islam, precedence over other systems. So there's a lot of Canadians out there that are worried about this. That, this is a slippery slope. And other than that, I think that covers the basic things. And again, technically in Canada, the wording is freedom of expression instead of free speech. And instead of hate speech, it's hate propaganda. And these are important things to know if you're going to be, making a stand for something that you believe in. You should, know your rights and also the boundaries that we have as Canadians. And other than that, that's pretty much all I have to say for an intro.
Right on. Well, thanks, John, for offering that up as an introductory explanation for how you want to cover this topic. Now, what I would say first and foremost when you're talking or referencing any documentation that has been implemented or created through the legislative process is legislation, as much as we would all wish that legislation is a representation of objective logic, reason, consistency of post-Enlightenment eras or an era of ideas. But what we should understand nowadays is because of legalese and propaganda and the mysticism of the state, and also the fact that there's an interpretation problem that we always have. And Canada, unlike the U.S., which in the U.S., this is what the great divide that I see in the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, the difference between the U.S. and Canadian law or British common law, as representation by the Crown, is they leave in Canada and in the UK, they leave what's considered a notwithstanding clause, which basically gives the government carte blanche ability to deny your actual inalienable inherent rights. Whereas the US accepted and acknowledged that freedom of speech cannot be infringed. In Canada, we don't actually genuinely have true freedom of speech. We have freedom of speech, but with certain clauses and exceptions, which to me, the minute you introduce certain clauses or exceptions, there isn't genuine freedom of speech. It's just political legalese to describe that we will set the boundaries of allowable speech, and allowable speech is not truly freedom of speech. So this is the part, and I'm just going to read and reference right now in Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So you can put forth under arbitration through the courts, you can put forth and present your kind of narrative, your kind of dialogue, or your opinion in respect to the concept of freedom of speech. But if they deem politically that their edicts have some kind of paramount importance...
Your sound is cutting out, your sound is cutting out a little bit.
Pardon me, sorry? What was that, John? Hello? You still there?
You're cutting out a little bit. I'm missing about 80% of
Hello?
I can hear you now. Now it's good. Maybe it was just a temporary.
Okay. All right, well, basically what I was trying to expand and expound upon is the fact that in Canada, we don't genuinely have actual freedom of speech entrenched in the psychology and in the culture. So in Canada, we have a quasi-limited ability to speak freely and openly, but we have to play within the certain parameters and paradigms which the state has set out. And like I say, the minute you step outside the bounds of their perceived conception of what freedom of speech or freedom of expression represents, they can then turn around and you kind of referenced M103. Well, that's an exact representation of what the kind of things I'm trying to espouse, which is there isn't no genuine freedom of speech. When the government can say, okay, you're not allowed to speak out against, which, you know, those were blasphemy laws back in the old days under the monarchs of Europe. But today we're not supposed to have any certain pretense or presentation from those who are supposed to be part of the establishment or the ruling class, where they're supposed to have any capacity to deny our rights or our freedoms to speak out. This is actually the most important thing, is our rights, and this is what I want all Canadians to understand. Your fundamental rights and freedoms do not come from government. So the minute you're referencing a document created or espoused by those who form government, once again, that's just people giving you permission. But an actual inherent right suggests that you don't need permission. A right suggests that it's not something you ask a master, right? To have freedom means you don't have to ask a master. So instead of referencing, well, we'll do it in this video just to do it for educational purposes. But for me as a human being, as a Canadian, I don't look to the Constitution, I don't look to the Bill of Rights, and I don't look to those in the political realm or who pretend that they're my authority for my morality or what I deem to be freedom of speech. I speak freely, I speak openly, and I speak responsibly, and I hold myself accountable for the things I say, but I don't look to the government to tell me how I should express myself. If they were to suggest tomorrow that what I do right now, just even by having this interview, if some politician suggested or a lawyer suggested that I have somehow stepped outside the bounds of their paradigm in my speech, then I would challenge them and I would go to bat with them. That is literally the point. And I have a meme on my screen right now that says, if you're afraid to speak out against tyranny, you're already a slave. So I'm not a slave to no man, to no woman, to no politician, to no government. I speak openly and honestly. Now, I would never solicit or suggest using hatred or vitriol or a suggestion of using violence preemptively towards any particular individual or group. But I am going to speak openly, whether M103 is a legitimate law or not. I will speak openly against people that I deem to be those who want to use the government as a means or a pretense to subjugate me to some kind of political orthodoxy. I refuse that stuff. So as much as I may very well respect some of the inherent wording of our Constitution or our Bill of Rights, that is not what rules my life. What rules my life is the morality that I understand that's objectively true. So I don't, as a libertarian, there's two fundamental things. The non-aggression principle, which is I don't use preemptive violence, force, coercion, or theft towards any other person, nor do I look to subject any person politically or socially or economically to what I have to say. I am just a free human being, and I expect other people to be free human beings too. So I will not associate my own morality with that of the state. Now, I understand we do function within the realm where a lot of people promote the state and think that they are the final arbiters that get to decide my rights. But once again, it's stated specifically, even within our own Constitution. If you've read it, you'll understand this, and most people who have, it says, let me just quote it right now directly from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, which means God is a concept that's outside the human realm, which means there's no political party or form of governance that can act as a supreme being or a supreme entity that gets to deny my rights just because they form some form of government or because they have a majority of people that may very well agree with their pretense or what they pretend to suggest. This is a representation of freedom of rights and speech.
I think that is an awesome philosophy. I don't know too much about libertarianism, but I'm learning a little bit every day. And you know, if I have one piece of advice, it's become a permanent student. Yeah, and get into what you like. You know, different people will like different things, but yeah, permanent student is my philosophy right now. Yes, yeah. So I think that's a great point of view. You know. And the government that we have now is, from what I see, it's less than ideal, to put it mildly. You know, back in the days of Stephen Harper, okay, I'll be honest, people out there, they hated him, you know. Sorry about the phone call. Now with Justin Trudeau, there's this word that keeps on coming up again and again and again, and the word is traitor, and I've never seen that, you know, for a Canadian PM. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna get this phone call. Sorry about that. That's my friend from high school, Fred. Yeah, he's a great guy. Works really hard, you know, to support his family, and he lives in Toronto, just down Victoria Park. But where he works is Mississauga, and he's making, you know, a 3-hour journey to go to work every day, and you know, that's. I think it's awesome that he's, you know, trying so hard, but maybe for our international listeners, you know, just describe Toronto. There's Toronto, and then to the east is Scarborough, and then to the west is Mississauga. Now, Mississauga is legally a separate city. It has its own municipal government. It has its own separate police force, etc. But basically, in effect, it is sort of like West Toronto, and there's a guy out there, and his name is Kevin Johnson, and he does the Freedom Report, and in Mississauga, and he's actually in a bit of hot water now, you know, having to go to court for, you know, something he said or something like that, and I mean, it's sad to see this in Canada. Kevin Johnston, he's not the only one, you know, people who, you know, say ABC or XYZ, and then the government doesn't like them, and, you know, they get taken to court for it, so it is an issue that is real, that is happening these days, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and obviously what we're seeing today is it's starting out predominantly in those in academia, but they seem to be very much pushing a political orthodoxy, just like this is what if those who understand history should realize that historical precedent used to be, and the people that would have been considered liberals in the classical sense were pushing back against, and this would have been of old world Europe predominantly before, you know, Western societies as far as North America come to fruition within the last 250 plus years or so. But even under the monarchs of old, during the European experience, as far as our ancestral historical precedent, it was kings, it was monarchs that got to dictate and control what people said or what they could express, their freedoms, what they represented. But that was the thing. Post-Enlightenment era, we were supposed to understand instinctively and inherently that no, freedom of speech, the point the very point of having freedom of speech is for people to be able to say things that are unpopular, things that are controversial. There's no point in having freedom of speech if we're just going to sit and agree with each other, right? That's literally the negative aspect of when people talk about freedom of speech. No, it's not. It doesn't have anything to do with the allowable opinion. The point of freedom of speech enshrined in law as understandable as an inalienable and inherent right is that you can say things like, even when I talk to people, and I have people that I talk to on a fairly regular basis that would be considered white nationalists. Now, while I might expressly disagree with some of their fundamental principles or preconceived notions regarding collective endeavors, because to me, I don't look at things as far as my skin color. I don't give a shit about skin color. I'm an ideas kind of guy. But if a white person wants to promote white nationalism, they have every right as a free human being to express their opinions whether other people like it or not. You know, even if I may disagree with someone, well, it goes back to the old expression, the old saying, the old quote is, I may disagree vehemently with what you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it. And the point of that is I might not disagree with you, but the only way we can ever find some way to be able to discuss these things rather than, you know, using violence as a means to impose our ideas on each other is that we can talk to each other, even if it might turn out to be heated debate, heated discussions, even that there might be conflict, even though there might be controversy. That is definitely superior than, you know, just running to your prospective political corners or your ideological corners and then, you know, building up your your resources as far as having some kind of civil conflict. That has never actually been a good positive outcome. You know, civil conflict, violent conflict, that's not a positive way to do things. The best way to do things, and the fact that we live in the age of information, it suggests that we should be using our words, our language to help educate, inform, and enlighten the people. And the minute anyone suggests that we should limit some kinds of speech, that's literally a representation of those who want to shut off and silence opposition to their political orthodoxy. And the minute someone suggests that, then you know they are the opponents of freedom.
Yeah, I agree. And where I live in Scarborough, it's actually just a little bit east. As you go more and more east, you see more and more Chinese people. And the thing is, you know, Chinese people, you know, within the last, 20, 30 years, you know, they've had the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it is still a bit of a dictatorship. So I think that when they come here to Canada to start a new life, I think the thing that they really like is that they're able to be free to say what they want, when they want, and I think that is a great thing. But I worry because I see, people like Kevin Johnson, getting in legal trouble over in the UK, the United Kingdom. There's a man by the name of Tommy Robinson, and he's being sent to jail for 13 months, and it's a worrying trend. Maybe I worry too much. I get frowns and ulcers from it, but I love Canada. When my time here is done, I hope that my my nephew and the young people here will be free thinkers and free speakers. Challenging ideas, my ideas, anyone's ideas, and charting their own destiny within this great nation, Canada, which I love 100%. It's the best. Yeah.
And as far as Tommy Robinson, I pay attention to these things too. And Tommy Robinson, while some people may not particularly like his methodology or how he speaks openly or freely about the things that matters most to him, his fundamental freedoms rely on the fact that he should be able to espouse what he has to say. So, this is the kind of thing that bothers me the most, especially from a place such as Britain, is they had a lot of history. Britain has a lot of history about at least trying to come to understanding the reasoning behind individual rights and freedoms. I mean, even if you look at, once again, back to the post-Enlightenment era, you had people like, Adam Smith, John Locke. There was tons of them that came from, Great Britain, whether they were British, or Irish or Scottish, and we understood for hundreds of years now that the whole point of freedom of speech is to say and express what you have to say and allow the people to listen and disseminate what they perceive as being moral or unjust. Now, today, by silencing Tommy Robinson, the ruling class have done two things that are fundamentally against the rights and the freedoms of individuals. One is to silence a man that, you know, whether you agree with him or not, is you're trying to silence a man that is just trying to rightfully express his particular opinion regarding the demographic change that has happened within his particular geographical area that he was born and raised in. And that's just like with anywhere. Listen, this in-group preference, or this understanding of what it is to be, whether you're British, you know, whether you're French. Some people might say, oh, well, that's identity politics on a particular scale. And I would agree with them to a certain degree. But listen, you're not going to beat nationalism other people, because the state is a direct representation of that nationalist endeavor. So they promote it into the people's minds. When you go to school, if you go to the school in the UK, you're all about promoting the United Kingdom and all that represents England. And then the minute the politicians or the ruling class of the day suggest that you're a bad person for now repeating or regurgitating the very things that you've been fundamentally jammed in your head since you were a kid, to me that is just outright disgusting for the people in the state, those who represent the government, to now going against Tommy Robinson when they basically promoted the fact. I mean, think about when there was World War II, right? Let's use World War II. What were the people doing that were fighting against the Germans, against the Nazis, against the fascists, right? Or when there was the Cold War, fighting against the communist regimes. They were promoting nationalism. Hey, we care about English common law. Hey, we care about the English people. We care about what England represents. But now all of a sudden, they've raised generations of people to believe in this kind of nationalism, and now they're hating on them because they're not repeating and regurgitating their new political orthodoxy, which is to suggest that no, England doesn't represent this typical white Anglo-Saxon culture. Now England is a totally different demographic. Now England is a representation of something that includes things such as Islam, right? No, that's bullshit. No, that'd be like me trying to raise my kids, in a certain manner, and the minute they've become adults, now I'm telling them, no, you got to think the exact opposite. Well, they're going to look at me as a hypocrite. And I would rightfully expect that they should look at me as a hypocrite the minute I try to espouse them something that's completely abject or contrary to the shit they've espoused the whole time while they were raising me. This is what is pissing people like me off. It's pissing people like you off, is we've been taught, right? We've been propagated. We've been indoctrinated into this particular faith and this particular social economic endeavors regards, whether it's our country of Canada or England or the US. And then once the political ruling class figures that they're going to try to reinvent the wheel and change the whole narrative, that we're just supposed to follow suit without acknowledging that, wait a minute, this doesn't align with all the historical precedent or all the historical knowledge or all the historical literature that you've been jamming into my head for 12 plus years through our education system. That's what they're doing. And to me, that's disgusting. It's vile. It's despicable. And this is why freedom of speech matters so much to me, is because we got to push back against this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree there, 100%. And getting back over to North America, they have, the Antifa. And I haven't physically encountered these people yet, but they show up at protests and they start, throwing rocks, burning flags, and, minor actions, minor so far of violence. And that's the state of things in Canada today, and it's crazy. And what should be happening is that two people with different points of view, they should sit down over a beer or a coffee and then start a conversation. And maybe sometimes it's going to get heated, but this tactic of violence, it is it's a terrible thing, I think, and in Toronto, the demographic for people on the right side of the spectrum, it's often older people, including, older ladies too, and it might be really scary and intimidating when you just want to hold a sign and someone starts throwing rocks at you and lighting things on fire. So there are some organizations out there, Soldiers of Odin, I think Northern Guard, that do provide physical security for the protesters, and I think that's a great thing, but yeah, it goes back to about 2 years, 2 or 3 years, and things were normal, but within that 2 or 3 years, it's like the whole entire world has gone crazy. You know, I'm still just trying to figure it out, but you know, the political climate these days, it's getting, you know, nasty, and you know, it's a sad thing to see. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about that great divide, especially now, what you're seeing is a direct representation of those who now have come to prominence and power. Because think about it, the old expression of, you think about who you can't insult today, right? When they talk about the patriarchy or male dominance or white male culture, the fact that you can constantly espouse that stuff and there's no genuine pushback, right? There's no laws against, or now there's not this promotion that you can be criminally charged for going against white people. No, it's the exact opposite. The exact opposite now is if you go against the LGBT community or Islam. So, I mean, the old expression of, if you want to know who rules over you, look who you're not allowed to insult. It's not men. It's not white men that you're not allowed to insult no more. If we truly lived in this patriarchal society, as some of these postmodernists, as these cultural Marxists suggest, then the minute these feminist groups or these LGBT community groups start speaking out in opposition to the white male patriarchy, well, you would see a direct representation of all these people being, you know, violently opposed or oppressed. But you're not seeing that. No, it's the white male today, and the statistics are out there proving it, that it's the white male today that are the ones that are being actively opposed and oppressed. And what it is, it's political power. It's political power. Certain people, and it's completely open and subject to every human being, because all human beings are subject to the corruptness of power. And now you have certain groups like feminists, which since the 60s have had a lot of dominant power, because a lot of people have subjected themselves to allowing feminists to have a dominant voice out there, because as with most men, like as men, we like to white knight. We love to you know, promote, you know, and help our female counterparts. But then there are those that take it too far, to the extreme. So now there's this point where you can't actually have any conversation and point out whether it's feminist groups or LGBT community groups or some of these Islamicists. Now you're not allowed to say anything against them. That's as soon as you close off dialogue. I mean, think about it in your own personal situation, your own anecdotal experience. Think about it in a family setting, because a society is just like a giant family. If you think about it in the objective macro sense, society is a representation of a big giant family. Well, think about what would happen the minute you tell one member of the family that your opinion doesn't mean anything, that your opinion is nothing but vitriol and hatred, and we don't have to listen to your opinion. Well, what's going to happen in a family where one person is the black sheep, the outcast? Okay, well, you've created that scenario, that situation, but that outcast is going to recognize that, wait a minute, I'm not espousing anything that's immoral or illegitimate. I just want to be able to express my opinion. So they're only going to double down on the fact that now they represent themselves as the oppressed. And while you're suggesting that they're the dominant oppressor, but yet they recognize themselves as being oppressed, well, that's where these civil conflicts happen. And if you allow it to stew long enough, which, you know, it takes years, sometimes decades, but if you allow that kind of thing to propagate and stew enough for a long enough period, you end up with civil strife and civil conflicts. And once those civil strife and conflicts start to happen, well, it's not a matter of just, you know, turning your back on it. It can turn into some very violent acts and deeds, and we don't want to go that way. We want to be able to express ourselves by people like you, by people like me, by people like Jordan Peterson, by people all from all different political orthodoxies or ideologies. Being able to express themselves is, at least we can hear what each other's got to say. We can understand where you're coming from. We can understand what your reasoning is behind your particular brand of ideology, or what you perceive as being rights or freedoms, and then we can discuss them. But the minute you try to shut me up or shut you up, Well, you're not. All you're doing is sending that. You're just trying. You're not going to silence people. No one has ever been able to silence anyone. You just send it to the underground. You just send it into the counterculture, and now you create a counterculture that is another representation of the victimology, of victim mentality, and that's never been a net positive, not for the oppressor and neither for the oppressed, because the oppressed person that believes that they're subject to the slave or to the ruling class, they don't have any self-esteem or self-respect, and the ruler that can control, manipulate, or dictate the thoughts of the other people, you're not going to benefit from them either, because you don't have the ability capacities of a free individual. So it's a net loss for everybody in society the minute you close off the ability to speak openly about the things that they care about.
Mm-hmm. I agree there, and I have a saying: the Cold War, it got damn hot sometimes, you know, and modern listeners, you know, young listeners, they might not really understand, you know, what it was like to live through, you know, the nuclear era, you know, the fear of nuclear war. Myself, I was born in 1972, but even growing up, you know, I could see a little bit of what was happening there, and you know, the Cold War is over now, and what I'm seeing is sort of like the resurrection of a 1400-year-old war between Christianity and Islam, and you know, I think that stuff belongs back in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. I think, you know, as people, we should start, you know, looking towards science, you know, to the stars, and, you know, taking care of our planet and, you know, advancing. But these old modalities of thought and belief are rising. And I do see, you know, among the Christians, the rise of Christian militancy. So that's my point of view on what is happening these days, yeah.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that out, because that's something historically, and being a white, you know, person from Irish and Scottish descent, I'm very much an understanding, and I come from a religious family, all about the Christian values. But that was the beautiful aspect of the Reformation of Christianity. So whether you're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament, the point of Reformation and post-Enlightenment era ideas was to reject the mysticism of old, that collective concept of sacrificing the individual for the greater good. Because what we've learned post-Enlightenment era is the individual can be a direct representation of the advancement of intellectual enlightenment and human evolution. So a perfect example of that would be, think about if you go back, you know, hundreds of years to the point when Galileo was out there suggesting to the masses that, hey, wait a minute now, the earth is not the center of the universe as the Bible suggested, as the Old Testament suggested. No, actually, you know what, the earth is just one planet in a solar system that has one star that we call the sun, that actually we revolve around it. Now, if you were someone like Galileo back in the day speaking these truths that we all understand to be objectively true today, you would have been considered a blasphemous. You would have been someone that was challenged the orthodoxy of the Christian churches back in the day. And you could have been hung, you could have been beheaded for doing so. But post-Enlightenment era was an acknowledgement that, wait a minute, we can never accept majority or groupthink as the only way to think. We have to understand that there are individuals with intellectual knowledge that may be surpassed or superior to those that are in their particular groups. And Galileo was a perfect representation of that. So today we're supposed to understand inherently, if we had have taken that post-Enlightenment era understanding and all that we've learned from it, we should all still be recognizing that, no, we can't sacrifice the thoughts of an individual to some concept of the greater good. No, we should respect every individual for their individuality, because we never truly know how much we can learn from that individual. And that's the part that really pisses me off, is now you got these collective endeavors and these group things, which to me is just like team sports. You know, team sports are fine in some areas, some regard, but not when you're breaking it down to the philosophical understanding of what it means to be a free human being. People say they promote individual or people. No, sorry. Let me rephrase that. People suggest they care about minorities, right? So those on the left that say, oh, they care about the LGBTQ community or, you know, the Islamists. Well, you know what? If you care about minority rights, as Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority on the planet is the individual. So if you don't respect the individual and for what they have to say or for what they have to offer, not just in terms of conversation or opinions, but what they represent as what they can provide to society, then you can't pretend to be truly free. You can't have a truly free society if you don't respect the individual freedom.
And I agree with that 101%. Yeah, is who we are as people. We're all individuals, and there have been, historically, regimes, dictatorships that take away that aspect of individuality, and things don't usually end up too well going down that path.
No. And no government, no politician, no pretense of any ruling class are ever going to respect our truly inherent fundamental rights and freedoms. If the people, this is where I'm going to place the responsibility on each individual in Canada, is without your willingness, right? Just whether you're talking, in past historical precedents, whether it's civil conflicts or global conflicts or wars, is if you're unwilling to stand up for your fundamental rights or freedoms, the ruling class, the sociopaths, the control freaks, they will push that narrative, or they will move that goalpost as far as they deem necessary. So that's why it's important for people like you and people like me to not just, kind of play that middle ground or try to play the political ground, but to expressly point out the fact that freedom of expression and freedom of speech are so important that I am willing to stand here today, not just in opposition, but to die for those fundamental freedoms. Not that I would ever look out to strive for any kind of conflict. I as a libertarian, I reject using preemptive violence, as I suggested. That's one of the very inherent philosophical endeavors of what it means to be a libertarian. I won't use violence against someone, but if you bring it to me, or if you try to close my mind, or if you try to silence my voice, then I look at that as that's where my rights do come to fruition. I am going to defend my rights whether you like it or not. And this is the message that if we do it enough, if enough of us Canadians are willing to stand up and fight for them and not say I'm going to, kill you, I'm not using violence. Just flex your muscle, Canada. As an individual, just flex your muscle and say, you know what? No. You, Trudeau, you Harper, you fucking Jasmeet Singh, any of you dipshits that think that you get to silence me or quell my voice, well, I'm here to tell you, you don't get to do it. And you will never get to do it. And until we're all willing to say that, even those of us, like a perfect example, even if you were a communist or a socialist, I would still be defending your right to say what you got to say. Even though I would vehemently disagree with it, and I would definitely be willing to stand up and say, listen, I'll challenge your pretense, I'll challenge your ideology, but I still say you have the right to say what you got to say. And we all have to do this. So Antifa, these fucking dipshits in Antifa, these are the ones that are, to me, they're the most closed-minded piece of shit I've ever seen, because in reality what you should be saying is, listen, I might not like right-wingers, but you know what, if they were truly principled in their stance, they'd be saying, but I stand in solidarity with the fact that right-wingers should be able to say what they want to say. And you know what? And the right-wingers, the white nationalists, should be saying the same thing as, you know what? You commies, you fucking dipshit Antifas, as much as I think you're all a bunch of idiots, I will defend your right to say what you got to say. But this is what happens in the political divide, is that the political pundit class and the ruling class, they find a way to divide us, so they put us into these groups, left versus right, and they get us fighting against each other rather than focusing our attention on those people that are truly fucking us up, those people that are truly trying to rule over our lives. And it's like, I just got to point out once again, and I'll probably point out many other times in the future, is stop fighting with each other, folks. You don't have to agree with each other with everything. Just like I don't have to agree with you, you don't have to agree with me on everything. But we should all at least agree to the certain boundaries, the certain fundamental principles and rules that we all have to live and abide by, which is you have the right to say what you have to say.
And I agree with you so much there. And maybe at the risk of repeating things a little bit, within the theater of Canadian politics, us Canadians, our political culture does not involve assassination, and it does not involve violence. And I always look back to a great man, Dr. Martin Luther King, as an excellent role model in that sense. So when he said, we're going to fight, he didn't mean a violent fight using, violence, but historically there are, systems out there that do use violence, and that's not what we're about, The level of violence that I like is at a hockey game, the hard checking and things like that. But then, other than that, it's something that is un-Canadian. It isn't part of who we are as Canadians. That's my point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, when you're talking about violence such as something in a hockey game, or in my particular sport of choice is in the mixed martial arts, that's a voluntary choice to enter into a contractual agreement where you're going to use violence against the other. I have no problem with that because people go into that relationship understanding that there's going to be violence used against them. In the realm of the state, though, none of us have entered into any particular obligation or contract where we suggest that some foreign entity should have any pretense of authority or power to dictate what we're allowed to express or what we're allowed to say. That is a contract we've never entered into. And once again, I won't even get into the whole area of taxation, but that's another contractual obligation that I have never entered into voluntarily. That's what I love about the free market, right? The free market, we enter into all of our contracts with an open mind and understanding of what the set parameters and set rules are. Just like if you were to sit down tomorrow and play a board game with your buddies or a video game with your buddies, everybody that's going to sit down and play that game, that board game or that video game, they're all going to understand the inherent rules of the game. And everyone will be able to hold each other accountable because the minute somebody steps out the bounds of the rules of the game, well, there will be, a pushback against everyone else that's a participant in the game. Say, hey, wait a minute, you're cheating. Government is a direct representation. The very concept of government is a direct representation where we all got to follow certain rules, certain arbitrary rules or edicts, but yet the ruling class gets to somehow negate, deny, or override those rules. That's bullshit. The only way you can have true freedom, individual freedom, is where everybody has to follow the same rules. The minute there's some group, some individual, some entity that gets to escape those rules, well, then you're not living in what's considered a freedom-oriented democracy. Now you're living under mob or majority rule. And under that scenario, it's no different than going back to like I say, whether it's the monarchs, the dictators, or the pharaohs of the past, now you're being ruled over by a political edict. And that's not any way for humans to flourish, especially in the modern age of information.
And I agree with you there. I think that we are de-evolving a little bit. These technological advances are fascinating and they're great, but I worry about what's going to happen. One or two generations in the future. Will kids be able to do their own math, like 1 + 1, 2 + 2, 3 + 3, etc., or will everybody be just relying on the technology? And I was born in 1972, and in my lifetime, from 1972 to 2018, I have seen, a huge change, a huge event in human history. And, social media, technology, that's, like it or not, it's part of the reality of the world that we live in. And, a thing about social media, Facebook, Twitter, I don't use Twitter, but you see these control things, and people, they go to Facebook jail for saying, A, B, Z, or X, Y, Z. The only time I've ever gotten in trouble with Facebook was when I was attempting to sing harmony and counterpoint to a Led Zeppelin song, the Battle of Evermore. So that's the extent of trouble that I've had, a copyright thing. And I don't like to brag, but I do have a few gray hairs, and as one goes on in life, that there is a certain wisdom that is, that is part of the natural cycle of life. So I'm not saying I'm like, someone who's like, super great in this or that. I'm just your average Canadian with, a little bit more wisdom, and I see what's going on today in the world, and it's just like, oh man, like what a facepalm, what direction are we really going in,
Yeah. Well, hey, don't sell yourself too short, John, because the fact that you're willing to speak openly and forthrightly about something that matters as much as freedom of speech does makes you superior in at least one endeavor to many Canadians, because there's a lot of Canadians out there that are unwilling to stand up and speak openly about these things. So I appreciate you for doing so. And, you know, I can't help but think every time I have these kinds of conversations, I pay attention. Now, I always acknowledge the individual first and foremost, but I can't help but see a particular pattern. You were born in 1972. I was born in 1970. That makes us part of the Generation X demographic. And to me, it seems to be that we, once again, this is just me using some kind of collective type of thinking, but I'm at least wise enough to point out that there are exceptions to the rules, there are outliers, so this is just a generalized statement. But I see that it seems to be Generation X in particular that are the ones that are most dominant out there, that are fighting for their individual rights and freedoms. And I can't help but think it's because of the fact that we were the last generation in modern history that actually had some sniff, some semblance of what freedom truly represented. Because when we were growing up, our parents, the boomer generation, were starting to be the first modern generation that were going into professional fields. So they were preoccupied, a lot of them, our parents, with what they were going to do with their own life. So we were still given, not that they were necessarily looking to give us our freedoms, but because they were so preoccupied with their own particular lives and their own particular endeavors, we inherited a lot of rights and freedoms that wasn't as if they were given to us. It's just they were too busy doing their own thing. So we got to understand freedom. And a person that actually understands freedom, having experienced freedom, the minute you try to take that freedom away, they'll notice it instinctively. Whereas the millennials seem to be raised in a more closed off, more closed-minded type of society, more structured, where their freedoms have already been somewhat taken away from them. So they aren't as quick to react and respond to the fact that there's more of their rights and freedoms that are being slowly eroded. We understand them because we knew what it was like. We actually grew up, just like you suggested earlier, we grew up under the Cold War era. So we understood what collectivism was all about. The millennials have been, you know, unfortunately, but at the same time fortunately, because I think they have the capacity at some point. I have two millennial age sons myself, so I think they're going to be great leaders in the future, but they just haven't had the proper intellectual knowledge put forth and presented to them, because those in academia that are teaching them. Now, my kids are an exception because they have had me in their life, but parents that are too busy out there proactively taking care of their own life, they haven't been active enough to teach their kids how important these freedoms are. They've been teaching them all about, you know, entitlements, but they haven't been teaching them about their responsibilities and how those entitlements, how those freedoms, not their entitlements, but how their freedoms are established and maintained. But they will get there. Just like with my kids, they help educate and inform their own, you know, their friends and their co-workers. We will all get there at some point in time. But it is very important for those of us in our Gen X, those in our demographic, to keep pushing back against the political orthodoxy of the boomer class, because they seem to have forgotten what it means, because they now have so many positions of power and authority in government, they forget what it's like to be on the opposite side of that coin. You know, when they were younger, it was their parents that were oppressing them, or who they perceived were. So, but now that they're the ones that are in those positions of power, influence, and authority, they seem to forget what it's like to be on the opposite side of the coin. So that's what us Gen Xers, we seem to be doing today, is at least pointing out that, no, there are, you know, alternative narratives out there. We don't have to constantly listen to this political propaganda from one particular demographic group. There are other people, there are other opinions, there are variances in what we perceive in the world that we live in. So it's important for those of us in Gen X to keep expressing what we have to say, keep pointing out the fact that, no, freedoms are important. I'd rather, like I've said on many times in the past, I'd rather live on my feet in under hard circumstances than die on my knees and be catered or coddled to by a ruling class. That's what freedom truly represents. And I think our next generation and the generations that are going to come successively after us, I think they need to understand this too. And the only way they're going to learn this is to assume not just their rights and their freedoms, but their responsibility and their accountability as well.
Definitely, I agree there. looking at the concept of freedom of expression and free speech, there's the political side to that, and then there's also an artistic side to it as well. I like heavy music, metal, punk, and things like that. And the band Pussy Riot, they go to jail in Russia. There was a documentary that I was watching yesterday about the Indonesian punk scene, and they're sent to re-indoctrination camps. They get their head shaved and everything like that. And I admit I'm not the biggest punk fan in the world, but I still respect it. And it tends to be a little bit more political than other forms of music. And when it gets to the point that you see the next generation of people, teenagers in their early 20s, and when you see that they are being stepped on, it's not a good thing at all. And sometimes, a person really does have to fight back in one way or another. And, when people are at that age, there's this kind of idealistic energy that they have. They want to change the world. They want to, go out there and, do ABC and XYZ. And I think it's a great thing. But I see also, young people getting quelled. And, I've got a nephew, and if anyone ever stepped on his, freedom of speech or freedom of expression rights, I would intervene. I would say, hey, listen, back off. This is Canada, And it's a thing that worries me is seeing, how on social media people are shut down. They go to Facebook jail for saying, ABC or XYZ. And, running a forum that had a free speech aspect to it, I've come across some pretty vile stuff in terms of the written word, and I don't like it at all, and it's very difficult. But what I would do is I would let those comments stand, and I would oppose them in one way or another. But it is it's one of the big problems that we're going to have to face, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years or 20 years in Canada. Is we as Canadians, I believe we have to put our foot down and literally stand on guard, because if we don't, then we're lost, I think.
Yeah, that's actually something that's severely lacking, especially for the millennials. Once again, I mean, as a Gen Xer yourself, and even boomers, we all, when we were raised, in our most informative, in our most important years, and whether it's in our preteens or our teens or early 20s, is we all understood, and it was the direct representation of arts and culture, right? So music, poetry, prose, literature, movies, television shows. There was always an underlying philosophical endeavor to teach people to have some counterbalance and counterculture to the orthodoxy of the ruling class. These millennials, the thing that I'm seeing that's really disturbing me the most is the younger generations, is they seem to be want to fall for this political divide where they got to hate on each other rather than the ruling class. And that's the part that I think is most disturbing to me, is you have to have a counterculture. And I'm not seeing that out there. I'm not seeing out there that's a representation. We might have had many different figures when we were growing up in the 80s and 90s that said, to rail against the man, to rail against the ruling class, to rail, and which was good. It kept our instincts heightened and on alert to be worrying about things that had to do with tyranny or oppression. Whereas the younger generations today, all they're hearing is that they're to blame for everything, and that it's the ruling class that's going to be their saviors. That to me is that's the most disgusting thing that I see out there, is they're not just looking to counteract those they perceive as their oppressors, but they actually want to use the power of the oppressive state as a means to an end. No. You're supposed to rail against the power of the authority, right? It's like asking the king to carry favor for you. No, you don't ask the king to carry favor for you. You tell the king to fuck you. I don't understand, I don't respect, and I don't fucking promote your power. But the millennials think that they got to use the power of the state as a means to an end. No. Stand on your, the best way to eliminate or shrink the role and the size and scope of the state, of those in government, is to pretend that they don't exist. And the only way you can do that is to be so self-sufficient, to be so self-reliant, to use disruptive technologies that some of their counterparts in their demographics, like Uber and Lyft and all these social media platforms. No. Make it so that the ruling class literally has no power over you. Point out that the emperor has no clothes. Don't appeal to the emperor. Don't ask the emperor to carry favor for you, but tell the emperor that I don't recognize or acknowledge your power or your authority. That's what the millennials are lacking today, or at least a substantial portion of them. I'm not going to paint them all in one particular way, because there's a lot of young kids that are out there that are actually doing what you and I are doing. So I'm proud of those that are standing up and fighting for freedoms, but I recognize through the education system, through the indoctrination that they're being taught, they're looking at the government, the state, as if it represents God. They look to, back in the old days, it was the conservatives, it was the orthodoxy of the ruling class back then. It was God get to subject you to the way he wants to rule over you. Now it's the state. Well, no, my suggestion, as with most libertarians in the philosophical sense, is you don't need any authority to rule over you. All you need is rules. You just need rules. You just need the rules. And those rules have to be universally consistent. They have to be moral. They have to be objective. And they have to be applied consistently. The minute there's any area where someone gets to escape those rules, well, then that's the point where you're going to have conflict that's not going to be resolved through anything other than violence. And we don't want to go the violent way. We've shown throughout history that using violence is never the proper way to do it. Right? Just like when let's say a person had a really, really oppressive, set of parents growing up. Well, okay, if they oppressed you, you could maybe, once you're an adult, you could go out and beat them up when you're big enough to do so. But have you resolved anything? No. You might feel better for a moment that you've got to impose your own force, your own will on them, but you haven't actually benefited them. You haven't taught them anything, and you haven't actually benefited yourself other than give you some immediate gratification for the fact that you beat them up. No, the best way you can do is be a leader and show those people that used oppressive means, show them there's a better way. And that's what people like you or I, that's what I think we're doing out here, saying, no, there's a better way. And the way to do it is using your beautiful ability to speak openly, honestly, and using that freedom of expression, that freedom of speech to say, listen, there's always a better way. If you're, especially, this is what I like to talk about people on the left side of the political spectrum. Oh, you talk about that you're all progressive. Well, if you're truly progressive, then we've got to progress back past this point where you think you can just close people's minds off. Let's get to the point where we're actually not just caring about freedom of speech and expression, but let's expand that out. As a matter of fact, in Canada, I would like to see all the hate laws that we have in this country, I would like to see them completely stricken. I would like to see us further advance our freedom of expression and freedom of speech to the point what the U.S. has, right? Where you actually don't have to worry about what you have to say. Where you can actually say and express whether it's good, whether it's popular, whether other people like it or not, that you can say what you got to say. Because you know what? The best thing about people with bad ideas is I can counter their bad ideas with good ideas. But if you try to silence my opponents that have bad ideas and I don't get to hear their ideas, the only way I'll find out about their ideas is when they use violence, because you shut their voice up. So the minute you put tape over their mouths, they'll recognize instinctively that the only thing they have left in their arsenal is to use violence. So let them speak. Whether you like it, whether you agree with them or not, let people speak. We'll come to an understanding somehow if you allow the freedom of expression, the freedom of ideas to flourish.
And I agree with you with regards to the hate propaganda or hate speech laws. We are now living in the 21st century. We have something called the internet. So if someone posts something vile, well, at least you know where to find them. If someone posts something that is simply not true, then you can challenge that, with citation. Say, this is actually what it is. See here, here, and there. Canadian hate speech or hate propaganda laws predate the internet, and I think it's time for us as a society to let go of those laws, and I think things are going to sort out themselves in the future. Yeah, so I agree with you on that point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great. And like I say, if there's anything right now, I know I've been doing a lot of the talking here right now. As you probably recognize this point, yeah, I always have lots to say regarding any topic that we talk about. But if you want to take control of the conversation now, I know you were wanting to reference in section 318, 319, 320, since we now are starting to talk about hate propaganda and the hate laws. If there's anything in particular you want to reference or point out, just go ahead and do so.
Actually, nothing that really comes to mind at the moment. And myself, again, I'm into heavy music, metal and stuff like that. And I look to places in the Middle East, and there actually is a metal scene, but the problem is that these young people are putting their lives on the line literally to make a certain form of music, you know. And that's one of the big things. If you ever get to know me, it's always music this, music that. It's one of the big loves of my life. And yeah, you know, and I've heard, you know, the most vile things that people can, you know, say. And it's not a pleasant experience sometimes, but that's life, you know. There's going to be good parts, there's going to be bad parts. And I think that a person, an individual who makes the effort to walk down the paths of free speech, that their life is going to be a little bit more difficult. It ain't easy, but it is worth that struggle, you know, at the end of the day. You know, when you can, you know, lay down at the end of the day and you look at yourself and you believe, okay, I did pretty good today, or I did the right thing today, you know. And you know, outside of music, the street situation in Toronto, I haven't seen it before like this. It's like every weekend there's a protest here, a protest there, and it all it is just going crazy, I think, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm the same. Well, I think a lot of us carry this very same instinct and our respect for the culture. So whether it's music or, like I say, movies or literature, you know, books, is humans look, this is just what it is to be a human being, is we're always looking for some arbitrary authority and the reason for being and the reason for why we're here. And we have to have a goal, a sense of purpose in life. And happiness alone isn't enough. You have to have a sense of purpose. And that purpose can come from, a lot of people historically got that purpose in life from literature, from things such as the Bible, or, you know, the teachings of the Quran for Islam, or from, you know, Judaism. There's lots of areas where humans have tried to saw out philosophical understandings and knowledge and proper morality, because we want to learn. We all are striving to learn, is how is it best for me to cohabitate and coexist with a whole lot of people, you know, in my community, in my country, in my province, whatever, is how can I do this best where we're all benefiting each other and there's as minimal strife and conflict as possible. And music has helped us in so many areas and so many endeavors historically, you know, whether you go all the way back to like I say, thousands of years ago. This is something that we've all used, and it's very important that we take these teachings and expand upon them, because philosophy, if you teach it just from, you know, academic senses, that can appeal to a certain particular portion of your demographic, but not a lot of people want to go into academia to learn philosophy. So the best way to do that is give them all kinds of areas that they might very well be more suitable to. So music is the perfect representation of how you can teach people to think, right? And just use it and express what you have to say in a more poetic, more rhythmic motion. And that's what I love about music, is you can get great teachings, great philosophical teachings, great principles, and understanding what it is to be, you know, a free human being, but in a way that's so subtle that you don't even recognize it as being adversarial. It's just something that you'll understand because you're listening to it, because you appreciate it. So I, like you, I've always appreciated the music, you know, whether it was, like I say, whether it's the 70s or 80s, or even if you go all the way back to when my parents were alive, the 50s and 60s, you know, all like rock and roll was a direct representation in the 50s. It was a direct representation of challenging the orthodoxy of the old cultures, right? So they were saying, no, we're going to do it my way. We're not going to do it the way my parents did. I'm going to do it my way. And that was great, because that's that change. That's that evolution, right? Because humans are not, we're not, you know, we're not robots. We're not just all seemingly autonomous or I mean, molded into one particular shape. No, we have lots of different areas where we want to express ourselves in different ways. And I'm very much appreciative of the fact that I can turn on my radio today and I can listen to, you know, music from many different genres and get a lot of those very important fundamental principles that I might have also been able to get from, like, say, reading the Bible, or maybe reading Aristotle or Socrates or Plato. But I can get it with a different form that's much more conducive to the modern society that I live in. So I'm very appreciative of music and some of the history and some of the cultural observations that people that chose to go into music and say, listen, I'm going to entertain people. Comedians do the exact same thing. Comedians will actually deal with and delve into some of the very controversial topics that you and I will talk about, but because they do it with humor as the basis for how they'll cover that particular topic, they take off that edge, and they help expand and enlighten on people without feeling like you're being lectured to.
Mm-hmm. And I agree there. And from the 50s after, of course, is the 60s, and around the year 1967. You find that a lot of music then, it was music with a message. Like everyone knows Steppenwolf, Born to Be Wild, right? If you've ever listened to a full Steppenwolf LP, it's a lot of political, aspect to it. What was happening back then in the late 60s, from, the fear of nuclear war, the war in Vietnam and things like that. And then, time goes on, 70s, 80s. In the 90s, you have bands like Ministry and Rage Against the Machine and Public Enemy. And those are, bands that their music has a message to. Now, I might not always agree, but I totally defend their right to say what they want to say. I love Ministry. But right now, I totally 100% disagree with Al Jorgensen. I think he's a genius, amazing. But right now, I don't agree with him. Like he supports openly Antifa, and I'm like, okay, well, that's your expression of what you believe in. I don't align with that kind of psychology. So I totally disagree with him, but I still think, he's very smart, he's awesome, but, sorry, when it comes to the point where people are burning our Canadian flag, throwing rocks, Molotov cocktails, and all that shit, that, at that point, you do have to draw a line, yeah.
Well, what comes down to, especially when it comes to these things like these direct representations of, and I kind of get it. So this is the part where I kind of understand people from both sides of the political spectrum. So I understand the whole pretense of why people want to challenge the orthodoxy of the ruling class, because there are very negative aspects of what it is to be part of the ruling class. So if you're Antifa and you're railing against the authority, I get that there. But just like within a family, like I say, let's say I was a kid that was raised by authoritarian parents. Okay, I might be against some of the things they did, but there's no, I don't think there's any human being that could suggest that my parents were all bad and that I should hate on them for everything they've ever done. So to me, it's a matter of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's okay if you're Antifa and you're railing against some of these things that you deem as being oppressive or whatever. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's have a conversation, which is what I try to do. But a lot of them don't ever actually want to have a conversation, which makes me think that maybe they're talking from things out of both sides of their mouth. Because if you're not willing to stand objectively behind the things that you espouse, it tells me that you obviously don't have the right footing. You're not basing your ideology entrenched on something that's foundationally true or objective. But I will agree with some of these Antifa groups as far as some of the things that the ruling class has done to oppress the people, whether it's the working class. The problem is you can't use a collective umbrella or a big broad brush as if to suggest that it's white people. This is where we disagree. It's like, okay, Antifa, if you want to point to individuals that have oppressed you, then by all means do so. But don't think that you can just say, oh, it's white people, or it's the patriarchy, or it's men, because then you're doing the exact same thing as those you supposedly counter, is by using preemptive violence and collectivism as a means to create this group. It's groupthink. And like I say, as a libertarian, I'm all about the individual. So if if some Antifa guy come up and show me that there was someone that used the violence, the power of the state against you, to oppress you, then I'll stand on your side. But if you're just trying to say, oh, well, because I have white skin, somehow I'm your oppressor, well, yeah, obviously I'm going to reject anything you got to say, and we're not going to have a whole lot we'll be able to work out if you just perceive me based on the color of my skin as your oppressor. That's where I think the Antifa group, but I think these people, like I said, a lot of them have been raised, these Antifa groups, a lot of these young people have been raised in very entitled homes. They don't understand what real hardships or strife or representation, and they're trying to find some way to be rebellious towards whether it's their parents or the people that they perceive as their rulers, but they're just not focusing their attention on the people that are truly the culprits.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with you there too as well. Uh, I even forgive them up to a point because they're late teens, early 20s. They haven't yet matured in the sense of getting wisdom about how the world works, and it's just when it gets to the point that they're throwing Molotov cocktails, and yeah, a line has to be drawn, and I don't want to see these protests escalate because when it happens, Canada is sort of like divide and conquer. It's just it makes our society weaker. Um, that's pretty much that pretty much sums it up, and you see it again and again through history. When the Romans invaded England, what they took advantage of was the different Celtic or quasi-Celtic clans there in that area of the world, and they would turn one against the other. And in the so-called discovery of the New World, same thing with the conquistadors, and they were the first expeditions. I've heard it was like 100, 200 of these conquistadors, and they are bringing empires down to their knees. And part of that was divide and conquer, that they took advantage of the existing animosities between the different Central American cultures. So that's what I'm seeing happening to Canada today. We're ripping and getting ripped apart from both ends of the spectrum, and it's not good.
Yeah, well, those who are this is the problem too with a lot of these leaders of these collective endeavors are people like to say they're stupid, but no, they're not stupid because they understand historical knowledge and the psychology of the human being, and they understand how easy it is to divide us because they realize that all you have to do is pit people into groups, right? This is something that the cultural Marxists have been good at for many, well, for a century and a half now, or 2 centuries actually, is if you find people's in-group preferences, you can exploit that by dividing them against each other, right? And that's something that I've seen that is so it's so historically detrimental to those of us, which is why, like I say, once again, I keep going back to why post-enlightenment, the individual, the acknowledgement of the individual, why it's so important. And which is when you see out there anyone that's on the political landscape, whether they're from the left or the right, anyone that rejects respect in the individual, to me, you have to be a representation of those who want to oppress people by the divide and conquer, the political means. Because the individual is completely on board and conducive with what it means to be a free human being. There's no such thing as a free group, and there's no such thing as a group that's a representation of any societal norms, because within that group, you're going to find everyone, even within my family. I could take 5 people out of my family, and I guarantee I'll be able to find all kinds of areas of difference where we disagree with each other on particular, whether it's philosophical, economical, or social policies. The difference is just like if we were to sit down and play a game or set up a society, is okay, you might have different preferences for yourself, but if we're going to live together, or if we're going to play this game together, or if we're going to create a society and have this pretense of a social contract, all we have to remember and resolve is that we have particular rules that we all have to abide by. The ruling class, the sophists, those who want to use political language and political legalese, they use that sophistry, that tricking of the language to deceive you so that they can divide us all. And then they are the ones that can step in. This is the problem that I see too. They'll divide us all, but then they can be perceived as the ones that will step in and try to resolve it, as if they're going to be the referee that's going to bring in this new utopian peaceful area or endeavor. No, that's not the case. No. We got to talk to each other as individuals. So with Antifa, I want to be able to talk to them. I don't want to ignore them. I don't want to insult them on a continual ongoing basis just as a pretense to get praise from people that are on the right, because I don't want that. I want to hold everyone to account to their own personal responsibility. And if you're saying things that I see that is completely inherently immoral or in contrast to individual rights, then I'm going to stand up against you whether you're on the right or the left.
Yeah, and on Facebook, most of what I post is just music, and I try to avoid the politics and the religion because I just see it as being such a divisive, a dividing force these days. I mean, the polarity between the left and the right, it is getting more intense, and there's a strong religious undercurrent that I see there. Now, with regards to the Antifa, I like to say, hey, man. My door is open 24/7. You want to sit down with me, drink a couple of beer and, talk about a different points of view? I'm always there, It's just they're not interested in having that kind of a dialogue. They think that they're going to win by, throwing Molotov cocktails at people. And it's not the way that things should be going,
Yep. Well, they're a direct representation today of the political orthodoxy I call it the religion of the state. Statism is literally religion. So people are always looking for a higher morality, a higher moral authority to dictate and control how they, just like when you're a kid, you're looking to your parents to be your moral authority, or your teacher, or your principal, or someone to be your moral authority. Well, today, because we've completely, mostly, or not completely, but mostly removed the concept of God as the pretense for a moral authority, now people look to the state as a moral authority. And what I've understood instinctively is I don't agree with any particular use of any pretense of arbitrary authority as a morality. But what I do understand is, in the absence of an overarching entity or umbrella such as God, the concept of God, which to me, I don't take the concept of God so literally that I believe it's just some dude sitting on a cloud, right? No, it's the archetypal type, like people like Jordan Peterson talk about. It's just a representation of what it means to be a good, decent, moral human being. Now, we can either get that from that external entity that we call God, or we can get it from other human beings. The problem I've always understood is once we place that power, that authority into the hands of a human being, whether they're from the government, right, the political or the ruling class, well then they're fallible. At least the concept of God, if it's universally consistent and morally ethical, then it's universal. So just like I say, just once again, like a set of game rules. If you say that, in Monopoly, there's certain rules you have to play within that game, as long as everybody has to play within those rules, then you'll have natural winners or losers, but the benefit or the outcome will be a direct representation of how much work, how much effort, how much thought, how much, consistency the people used in playing the games. Whereas with political authority, with arbitrary authority from the state, as we've seen, look at how many times rules change. The rules of government has changed constantly depending on which political party comes to power. So just like in the old day, people used to say God was the ultimate authority, but how they broke it down is they broke down that authority into political factions, or back then they would have been considered religious factions. So the overarching umbrella of authority should have been maintained and resided in this concept of God. But what it is humans invented churches. So it was a representation or their particular way of reading the Bible. So you have Catholics, you have Protestants, you have Presbyterians, you have Baptists, you have all people that are reading from the same Bible, but they interpret it to give their own in-group a particular sense of morality over their other groups. Government is the same thing. So it's just like conservatives, liberals, or NDP, they're all, to me, they're just like Catholics, Protestants, or Baptists. They're all just trying to figure out a way to make it so that their particular brand of their religion, the religion of the state, has the moral authority. In reality, no, it's not the particular breaking down from each group. No, there should be just one overarching umbrella that is a representation of universally consistent moral ethics. So, don't hit, don't steal, right? You don't need, when I say like you shouldn't use preemptive violence against someone, I don't have to break that down to Catholic or Protestant or Baptist, nor should I have to break it down to being conservative or liberal or New Democrat. It's just a universally consistent message. There should be no pretense that we get to interpret that in three different ways. No, it should just mean that you don't get to use force or violence or preemptive theft against other people. But this is what happens when you try to take things and put it into the political realm instead of the philosophical realm. The philosophical realm understands that, yeah, we all have to abide by the same rules. The political realm is to suggest that no one particular group, one particular ideology has some kind of supremacy over the other, which is completely bullshit.
Yeah, for me, when I see the Canadian political system, it's okay, but the problem is that it's so partisan. I would love to say, okay, I support ABC and I support XYZ, but I'm opposed to this. But we're all sort of channeled and funneled into this sort of like this tribal political culture where, you know, it's the right wing that's right or it's the left wing that is correct, or et cetera, et cetera. And I don't like that. And I think that people should be able to vote on issues. And hopefully more of that will come to us in the future, but I don't know. For now, it looks like different tribes, you know, just fighting against each other. And I don't want to get involved in it. I have better things to do with my time, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Thankfully, because of people like you and I, this is the beautiful thing about the age of information that we currently live in. And I'm glad that you and I are taking advantage of this situation. Is we can help. You know, we're probably not going to help a whole lot. You know, those that are of the much older demographics, whether it's the boomers or the greatest generation, right? Our parents and grandparents. But what we can do is have conversations like this where other people that are younger than us can learn these kind of truth, this kind of information, and realize that, hey, wait a minute, yeah, I don't have to fucking play on Team A or Team B. I can be an individual that can point out that, hey, sometimes Team A is wrong and sometimes Team B is wrong. And I can just represent what I believe to be morally consistent messaging without having to play this in-group tribalism bullshit. Because that's the part, like you're suggesting, that's what we have to reject. You know, we have to reject this goddamn overarching collective endeavor where people just put themselves into one particular team, and no matter how immoral the teachings are from that particular team, they feel that they got to be blindly loyal to them because they're scared of their opponents. I'm not scared of any, like, that's the thing about being a brave individual, you know, self-sufficient human being. I'm not scared of NDPers. I'm not scared of liberals. I'm not scared. I just want to help expand upon and educate and enlighten those who might not perceive the differences and understand that it's okay to be different. That I'm actually very appreciative of the fact that we have differences. I can't imagine, actually, I think I saw a video that you had made there when I was scrolling on my feed. You were basically pointing out, I was kind of glad when I see it. It's like, yeah, who gives a shit about? I like the fact, I think it was about music that you were referencing. I'm glad there's not one genre of music. I'm glad there's not one kind of fucking food that we eat. I'm glad there's all kinds of variances. When I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about a leftist political talking point. I'm talking about actually diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, diversity of, you know, human beings as individuals. I'm glad that's the case because that's what's given rise to our ability to have all that we take advantage of today. I love it. I don't care, like I say, I don't care about the color of your skin. I don't care about, you know, maybe what religious background you might have had. I don't care about if you're a man or woman. I don't care about what's between your legs. I care about what's between your ears. I care about what's running through your mind. If you're a good person and you're willing to listen to other people's opinions, their preferences, and respect them, then I'm cool with that. It's a big old fucking planet. Was it 27,000 miles in diameter, basically, or in circumference? We got lots and millions, millions, and millions of acres. We're all going to be okay if we can just learn to start respecting each other as the individuals we are.
Yeah, I agree there. And you know, the future, what it holds. You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a prophet or anything like that. But I see that my guess, I would bet that in the next 10, 20, 100 years that things are going to get really difficult for people, you know. You know, this part of it is earth changes, also just differences in the political climate. So I think that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of bad stuff in the future. So I say, you know, start arming oneself now with, you know, good thoughts, you know, try to be intelligent, try to, you know, learn and things like that. Because, you know, life is sometimes pretty harsh. But it's a great journey, you know. As long as it's something in your heart, you know, then things will work out.
And do like what you're doing now, and like what I try to do on a regular, ongoing basis, is lead by example. You know, you know, as much as like even doing my videos, like a lot of times I try to help, like I say, educate and enlighten people through that particular method. But in my own personal life, because that's the part where I actually have the most influence, is because the people that know me know me. So I just lead by example, right? And that's I think that has a much better effect on the psychology of the people around me than just trying to play politics, right? No, just be a good, decent, moral person, lead by example, and then hopefully that will rub off onto the people that surround themselves with you, and then they'll pass that off to people that they surround themselves with. And it's just the best way for us to do it. Because if we keep going to that room or that realm where we just try to use government as a means to oppose our ideas on everyone else, then all it does is cause everyone else to want to do the same with you. So if I use preemptive violence, like the power of the state against someone else, well, they're going to try to do it to me. And it's going to be that back and forth all the time. But what I prefer to do is, like I say, I lead by example. I don't use the power of the state. I'll use my power of my voice. I'll use the power of my intellect. I'll use the power of my whether I'm out building things for people or delivering products to people. Whatever I do, as long as I know I'm doing something that's prosperous, fruitful, and helping others, then they will want to reciprocate that. And I think that's what most people actually want to do. Most people inherently, I think, are at least reasonable. We have that flip side of the coin where we can be good and bad. But I think most people prefer to just be decent so that it helps themselves. It's not that that's the thing too. It's not altruistic. People aren't good people just because they want to be good for other people. You're a good person because you know it's beneficial to you. I'm a good person not because, I just want to help everyone else. I'm a good person because I know if I'm good to other people, that most of them will be good to me. So it's a reciprocal relationship that I'm expecting. I'm not doing it as an altruistic that I think that I just got to be good to help you. I'm doing it because it helps me as well. And as long as we understand that when you're a good, decent, moral person, it's a reciprocal benefit where we both win, then there should be no counter argument that would be in opposition to it. So like I say, rather than jumping into the political realm, doing what me and you are doing today, matter of fact, I bet you that me and you, what we're doing today, is going to have more of a positive effect on people than someone going out and putting fucking signs on someone's lawn or giving 30-second political talking points. No, it's being able to expand upon the things that matter most, because people are sick and tired of these little fucking 30-second sound bites, these political talking points that doesn't really say anything. They just give these little tiny sales points, these sales pitches, but it doesn't expand on to help educate and enlighten the people. What we're doing today is expanding upon our thoughts. We're not just saying I care. Yeah, it's easy to say you care about freedom of speech, but what does that mean? Well, me and you have taken now already an hour and a half to explain in depth with a lot of articulate knowledge in what that truly means. And that's how people truly learn. And I think me and you and others like us are the ones that are going to be the leaders of liberty, that are going to help bring this in. And we're not going to have to do it through the political realm. We're not going to have to do it through using, government power or mandates or edicts. We're just using social media and the power and the ability to freely express ourselves. And hopefully enough people will get on board, and hopefully we will expand ourselves to the point where in the future we'll advance humans one more step into what it means to be individuals who are free from forced subjugation and in slavery.
And I agree there. I think it's going to be a difficult journey to get to that point. And also with regards to myself, I don't really see myself as leadership material. I like to, think of myself as a relayer. I'm, sending a message to people, whether the message is good or bad, who knows, but getting, things from point A to point B, and just facilitating that concept of communication. And again, I might agree, I might disagree, but the big thing is that people do have that freedom to say what they want. And sometimes that can be a really difficult thing for people in other areas of the world. Canada, okay, we get some trouble, but in certain parts of the world, you say this or do that, and then they're going to execute you, we see it in history through, communist dictatorships. We see it in Islamic regimes where people are, being oppressed in a way that most Canadians, we can't understand it. Like, we can see it on a documentary, but we don't know exactly, like, emotionally in our heart, what it is like to live in that kind of a harsh regime or dictatorship. So, big world out there.
Yeah. And people don't truly respect and appreciate the freedoms that they have until they're gone. And that's what we're trying to fight hard for now. Is I don't want to get to the point where we got to fight this battle that's taken, like I say, the culmination of whether you want to go all the way back, like I say, to the fundamental philosophical things of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, or whether you want to talk about a few hundred years ago in the Enlightenment era. I don't want to go back hundreds of years or thousands of years and try to start all over, which is why we are, you and I and people like us, are taking advantage of this age of information and trying to prevent or stave the imposition of another authoritarian regime stepping in and using political language or sophistry to create divide and conquer, where we're once again having to go through another violent civil conflict, or who knows, maybe ultimately a global war. I don't want that. You don't want that. I don't think anyone really wants, well, there might be some people that want that, but I think the overwhelming majority of people don't. We just want to expand upon the fundamental principles of freedom that we've already learned, and to start understanding what it means, what it truly means to be free. Because freedom is something that most people, it rolls off the tongue easily, but they don't seem to understand that it's not just your rights, right? Those rights, it's easy to espouse the rights, but those rights, they only exist if you're willing to defend them. Without your willingness, without your capacity, without your ability to defend those rights, they're not truly rights. They're just privileges that some political establishment has given or afforded to you. So to have genuine freedoms is to have genuine courage and conviction to stand up for them. And you're willing to stand up for them. I'm willing to stand up for them. And by us speaking openly about our willingness to do so, it emboldens many others to say, you know what? Hey, if these guys are willing to do so, well, maybe I should too.
I agree with you, and me, you know, just people know me as Johnny. I don't have any big university degrees. I don't have, you know, big college degrees. I got, you know, a little bit of library science, but in a way, just kind of like your average Canadian, in the sense that, you know, I love, you know, Canada overall. Not everything, you know, some of the stuff that goes on in Ottawa, it's not my cup of tea, but you know, I see that, from my point of view anyway, that I'm so lucky to be here, and you know, I think I take it for granted a lot on some days, and I think one of the improvements that I need to make is to have a little bit more gratitude for this chance that, you know, God or fate or whatever is given to me, you know. So yeah, it's, gratitude is a big thing, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. No, I think, like I say, I think we've done actually a pretty good job. And if you want, we can start tying this up now, because I'm not even sure that we can expand upon any further than what we've already done. I think we've done actually a pretty good job, and I appreciate you having this conversation with me today, John, because this is the kind of thing that I care about the most, is giving anybody, I don't care who you are, I'll give anybody the chance to say what they got to say, because there's a lot of those in the establishment media that won't. They only want to have particular dialogues, particular narratives put forth and presented. Whereas, you know, in the age of information, we have the capacity and the ability to say what we've got to say without having anti-interveners, without having any interveners or moderators that are going to suppress or deny our ability to say so. So thank you very much, John, for having this conversation today and being willing to speak out and openly about your willingness to stand up for the freedom of speech.
Thank you, sir. And also, thanks for teaching me a little bit more about libertarianism, something that is a new subject for me. So now I'm curious. I'm going to go, you know, read articles here and there. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. And if you ever do want to do this again, and you want to even start delving into like the whole topic of what libertarianism represents, because once again, it's just basically a modern iteration of classical liberalism, but expanded and espoused upon, just like the scientific endeavor, right? So you can expand on anything that, when you talk about fundamental principles, you know, if you care about individual rights and freedoms, the libertarians, all they do is it's a scientific objective endeavor, basically, as far as social and economic policy is if we care about individual rights and freedoms, well, how can we expand and espouse on them so that there is no inconsistencies, so there's no immorality, so that there's no contradictions to the terms and the words that we use? That's all a libertarian represents, is self-ownership, basically, which is private property, and private property starts with me. My body is my property. Nobody has control, or nobody has any right to rule over me or have authority over me. So expanding upon that, and the non-aggression principle, which is not to use preemptive force, violence, coercion, or theft towards other people. These are things that we've actually all learned very young and very early on. That was a direct representation and a result of the post-Enlightenment era and the Christian values in the New Testament, as opposed to the Old Testament, that still sacrificed the individual for some concept of the greater good. It's all about expanding and promoting the individual and what it means to be a free human being. So if you want to have this conversation, let me know sometime in the future, and we can I definitely can talk my ass off when it comes to understand what it means to be an individual and what the fundamental freedoms and liberties of what libertarianism entails. So we can do that at some point in the future. Just touch down with me, and we will.
Okay. Thanks again, and have a beautiful weekend.
You too, sir. Have a great time, and we'll talk to you again. Once again, another great conversation from another fellow Canadian. This time, someone who wants to espouse and talk about a very important topic that I think we all care about, which is freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And freedom of association. That too. That's another important aspect of what freedom, individual freedoms, truly represents and entails. We didn't really expand on that aspect of it, but freedom of speech is something that obviously is something that is very important for every one of us as individuals. So thanks once again, John, for having this great conversation, and I hope to have another conversation with you in the future regarding what it means to be a free individual in this modern world. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.